I came to know about Bohm dialogue in the late 1990s. I was then teaching in a business school, and the government business school, as a matter of fact. And when I read through the book of Peter Senge, what the dialogue was all about, I had an intuition that it was a powerful practice for adult education. I was doing, at the same time I was teaching, I was doing a PhD in adult education, and I was a little bit annoyed by the fact that adult education was all oriented towards making productive people who work well in the workplace, and there was no adult education to help the development of consciousness or to become more and more able to live in a complex world. So as I read what it was all about, I said, I think we have there a way to facilitate the expansion of consciousness in people who are trying to live more at ease in the modern world, to use the expression of Bob Keegan, who wrote "In Over Our Heads, the Mental Demands of Modern Times."
Yes.
So that was the trigger for me.
It was a trigger, yeah. And yet, and you have kept with it. So say a little bit more about what keeps you at it. What does it do for you personally that you really care about?
Yes, I kept at it because of a few things that I would attribute to serendipity, and other things that made me feel that indeed it was an intuition that made sense. The first serendipitous way was that I met a colleague who was also I was doing my PhD on, I decided to do my PhD on dialogue, and I met a person living in Quebec who was doing his PhD at Seabrook Institute in California on Bohm's dialogue. And we created an alliance, and we decided that indeed we both saw what it could do for managers to develop their ability. So we started, and I did an experiment with 16 managers and 16 dialogues, and it was an action research. So we recorded the dialogues, then we re-listened to them, and they found that they were developing some abilities that they didn't have before. And at the same time, my colleague who was doing his PhD with long-term practitioners of Bohm dialogue was also finding that they could identify capacity to see their own supposition, able to stay with paradox, and so on. So the research and the fact that people became enthusiastic about our offering of teaching them how to do dialogue, all that contributed to keep me alive and well in that field.
And you did that for a number of years, like 16, 17 years, right? With was that with Mario?
Yeah, I did. We introduced group dialogue and meditation in a MBA course at Laval University, and we kept it more or less in the same way for 17 years. The course was a one-year course for managers who wanted to take it as a MBA or wanted to do some continuing education for themselves. So they were all, it was in the context of an executive MBA, so they were all engaged in work. And we thought that we would help them develop through thematic teachings. So we were trying to keep on the top of the newest discoveries in emotional intelligence, theory U, theories of complexity, and also mindfulness and stress reduction and all that. And we said, okay, we will open, contribute to open their mind through some academic teaching on new research on brain and everything. And then we will also ask them to do two practices. One was to meditate every day for 20 minutes to half an hour, and we introduced them to meditation. You know, in the year 2000, it was not so popular to meditate. Now you're a little bit ashamed if somebody asks you, do you meditate? And you say no. It's like, you know, you smoke. But we introduced meditation, and we asked them to fill a practice sheet so that we knew every time we met that they had actually done it, and we engaged in dialogue. What in Bohm's dialogue, what it didn't do though is to give us a sense of whether meditation weighted more in the development of certain characteristic qualities and abilities, or if the dialogue did way more. But we knew that the combination, which is asking a great level of self-observation, observation of what is coming up in oneself when somebody says something, we were developing the capacity to see one's own mental models. So we know that the two together were powerful for our students.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any other universities or college settings where these kinds of programs were going on? Or are you now?
What I didn't work with other universities. It was enough to work. I had 2 courses at Laval University, but what happened is that a well-known school of coaching called New Ventures West, maybe you've heard of it. It's a California-based coaching school. They have a French branch in Quebec, and they asked me if I would use dialogue to for the continuing education of graduated coaches. They thought that the way of entering dialogue that is presented by Bohm was an expansion on you know, the more psychological way that we have to teach dialogue in a human relation field. So I do that, and I have done I have done group dialogues outside the university in Montreal for many, many years also. And now I have a group that includes mostly people who had taken my courses at university, but also coaches, graduate coaches who wanted to continue.
Yeah, I want to sort of get into the content a little bit, Marie-Ève. And I was so drawn to your six invitations. And what I was particularly liked about it was that for many of them, you provided a sort of a personal experience out of your from your own life or from others. So would you talk about those 6 and maybe give us an illustration to the extent that they come to mind for those 6 invitations?
Yes, I can. The invitation, I want to say that I used invitations, and I used the word qualities of the heart and mind rather than competencies. I have a bit of a vendetta against the competency movement because I saw that in businesses, they were developing competencies and smaller. So somehow to be a senior manager, you had to have 72 mini competencies that they were measuring. I thought this is crazy, really. And so the idea is to develop qualities, and in French we use disposition, which is what you're inclined to do. And the first one was accepting that we are related. And this acceptation that we're all related, I think we have a global lesson in that these days with the coronavirus, that indeed we are all related. But it was for me the first one to break the idea that these people are like me and they are the only ones that I will deal with. We talk a lot about what is happening on the social media with the polarization and so on. And so I thought, indeed, if we were able to see the humanity of people beyond their opinions, and the work of David Bohm is very good, particularly good at making us take a look at the opinions we carry and make a distance between, to disidentify from our opinions in order to meet the other. Well, the other one was questioning assumptions. And the questioning of our assumption is something that is needed in our world today, because not long ago in the history of humanity, people were not penetrating each other's inner circle. Like now, we have in the city where I live, we have Italians and Chinese people, and they are no longer just outside at the periphery. And one thing that I realized is that they demand to be part of the democratic dialogue or the discussions. When I was young in Quebec City, which was a smaller town than Montreal, we had two Chinese people, two Chinese person in our neighborhood. One had a service of mending and cleaning clothes, and the other one had a restaurant where they were serving American type of Chinese food, you know, sweet and sour spirits and things like that. And that was our little drop of exotism in the neighborhood. But nobody ever thought of asking them what they thought of us or what their opinion was. They were strangers without a voice. Now strangers have a voice, and that was very important, that we open up to see our own collectively held assumptions, and the people who come from outside, they help us to not only look at individual assumptions, but those that we hold so tight as being our way of being. And so that was another one that questioning assumptions. And there is another one that is I have to remember them, to listen with your whole being. We have in French an expression, listening to the bones. It's like listening until you're penetrated to the core of yourself. And this is very different than listening from a perspective of active listening. Actually, it's more a passive listening in the sense that you open the field and you listen and listen until you really have a sense of the other. And that was a method that I learned from the Diamond Heart approach, where you have monologues or people repeating questions, but you just hold the space so that the other one expresses himself or herself completely. And so I did include that in when I introduce people to dialogue, what it is to listen to the bones, to really be where the other is, which means that you mute your own presuppositions during the listening time. And
when you were talking about that one in the book, you used a Carl Rogers quote, which I really liked, which is, "There is nothing this person has experienced that I cannot share with him or her. No fear I cannot understand, no suffering I cannot care for," which is a lovely quote around listening with the whole being.
Yes. And it reminds me of another quote that had an incredible impact on me when I was maybe about 14 years old. You know, I was in a college where we were doing classical studies. So we studied Terence, who was a dramaturge, was writing theater plays in Rome. And he said at one point, "I am human and nothing human is alien to me." And somehow I had the impression that I had read at that time a sentence that would have an impact for my whole life. I had the impression that I had discovered a very serious sentence. And this idea, I'm human and nothing human is alien to me, drove me first to study criminology. I worked in penitentiaries, then to study humanistic psychology. I became a Gestalt therapist, and this idea of understanding what it is to be human, shadow and light included, this opening was guided my life until now.
And then another quote that you use, a Bohm quote, when you're talking about the invitation to question with warmth and curiosity, and I hope you will tell the story that you wrote about in there about the person who made assumptions that he wasn't valued in the group, because that was so wonderful. But the quote, which I really love and I've used myself over and over, is, "Dialogue cannot exist, however, in the absence of profound love for the world and for people. The naming of the world, which is an act of creation and recreation, is not possible if it is not infused with love. Love is at the same time the foundation of dialogue and dialogue itself." And that's such a lovely quote that you put in from him.
Yes, yeah. One time I was holding a dialogue group, and there is a man who had he was a bit of a nervous type, but he had the following time tried to express something, and had this experience that we've all had in Bohm dialogue, that you throw something in the middle and nobody builds on it, and he arrived already charged at the dialogue group, and there was a person who had actually said something in opposition to what he had said, but not at the very moment, later on. Anyhow, he saw this person as an enemy, and he started to observe him, and he saw that the person was not greeting him and was still talking to others, and that somehow when the dialogue group started, he suggested that we bring back the topic of the week before, but it was not retained. Anyhow, he constructed a whole rejection story, a narrative that he believed in completely, and until he decided for himself that he will not come back to the dialogue group. So I had to deconstruct that, and I was helped by our jurist in this way of going down the ladder of inference that he had used to declare himself unsuited for the dialogue group. So that that happened more than once. This one struck me, but in dialogue groups, because there is this idea of impersonal fellowship, people who are really who need to feel very close, very accepted personally, very seen, and so on. It takes them a while to adjust to the fact that there is this distancing of between or this idea that emotions are thoughts, and that we are not there to be district nurses to somebody who is having an emotion. You see, they don't have the emotional charge that they are used to in T groups. So I have had to have private conversation with quite a few people in dialogue groups to make sure that they understand what this idea of impersonal fellowship is all about.
And that was one question I had, because I wondered how many dropouts did you ever have? People that just, thought they wanted the class, tried it, and said, wow, this just isn't for me for whatever reason. Did you have any of those, or were you able to work with them enough to have them see? And
yeah, there are lots of reasons. In the course that I did with my colleague in Quebec, we didn't have dropouts. They stayed because we explained to them what it was all about, and that we needed their commitment for the whole year. In Montreal, people who register, I ask a commitment a year at a time. So if they register for September, I ask them to stay until July, until the end of June, and they do. They stay. Some come back year after year. I had the impression that after a couple of years, they would say, well, okay, I know what it's all about now. I do it in my own way. But now they come back. They wanted this space, and it's well understood now that we do that as a practice field, so that we we develop, we become carriers of dialogue in our life somewhere else. So there is no longer in the groups, there is no longer any questioning, but are we going to ever solve something through dialogue? No, it's a practice field for listening, self-observation, and also more and more, I try to raise the level of questioning to the to commonly held assumptions, so that we examine them more than personal assumptions, or as well as personal assumptions.
One other question I've had, I went down the psychological or the Jungian path as well, as part of what I've done. Then I came back to dialogue, and I've often wondered, have you tried this kind of class with therapists or with the mental health arena?
It would be very interesting. Because of the fact that I was associated with a coaching school, there are some that are also psychologists, because now coaching is the thing to do. So many therapists become coach. But I have not worked in the mental health field. Did you mean, Linda, to work with therapists, to work with people who have mental health problems? Or people?
Well, no, I meant with therapists, because in one of your papers, I think at the conference you delivered, you mentioned that you were now doing work more generally with just a general population outside the business school. And I was just wondering, and you mentioned facilitators in the organizational development field, and I thought, I wonder if she's done any work with therapists who simply want to self-develop, because a lot of the same skills you're talking about, the same qualities that are developed in dialogue, would be so useful for therapists to have. You know, that deeper listening, the help that people get in terms of disidentifying from their own ego states so that they can grow. So I'm just kind of curious if you've had any.
I would love to. I have not. One thing, yes, I would love to work with therapists, but I find it more useful so far to work with mixed professions together rather than just go and specialize with, but perhaps there is a place for that too. And why not with people who have mental health challenges, the patients themselves, there could be a place as well.
Right. The one other question I was sitting on was, when I read through your paper from the conference, was it seemed almost like people who had developed a sense of post-conventional consciousness, they were the ones that really saw the value in your work. And they would probably be the ones that would want more of your work. Yes. So what about people who have not reached that stage? How have you been able to attract those into your group? What seems to be working?
It attracts people who are at the conventional stages. Now, I make an assumption that people have dealt a bit with that literature on the development of consciousness. You know, the word used by Tarbert, achievers, for instance. But there are people who are in the passage from the conventional stages, the more two post-conventional stages. So that helps. Dialogue helps with the passage. But if they are too far behind in terms, because it's a hierarchy, let's not cheat on that. It's a hierarchy not on personal qualities of the heart, but it's a hierarchy of complexity. It doesn't make sense to have dialogue in the Bohm way with people who are in the very traditionalist mindset, who see authority as coming from outside and who value obedience, and so that they could have very lovely dialogue within their own community. They have what I call the ronron dialogue, the dialogue that where you don't question assumptions, but you're together. This type of dialogue is only to reassert your togetherness. That you can have, but a dialogue where you would be questioned is very difficult for them. And I want to say something about post-conventional stage. In all the literature, the first post-conventional state is called the relativist, or people who are able now to to see things with a certain, to see truth as relative. But at this moment, this stage is not good enough to help us through a crisis. The second post-conventional state is one who sees the whole system. And I'll give you an example of what is happening in Quebec. The baby boomers are not obedient to the government rules of stay home. The baby boomers are many baby boomers, educated baby boomers, are relativists. So everybody's truth is a good truth. And now we have to call upon obedience. And it's quite interesting to see that teenagers and baby boomers are the difficult ones. But at a certain stage of post-conventional way, you see that the system needs sometimes the system needs that we become more conventional or traditionalist. At other times, it needs that we break a truth and so on. So this is my hope that the work with Bohm's dialogue bring us to that level that is called sometimes strategist or holistic, or where we can use whatever language and level that is needed at the time. And
yeah, I'd rather go that way rather than trying to make things more simple, like you pointed out. I mean, when people get very anxious and overwhelmed with the speed of change, I think that's why you titled your book as you did, Dialogue in the Age of or Digital, or what is it, Dialogue?
In the digital age. Yeah.
People have a knee-jerk reaction. They want to go back. They want to go back to simpler times, but that's really not possible. So if we don't develop these skills, we're going to see even more of this sort of breaking apart, like we saw with Brexit, or like the American election election process. So I'm hopeful that your work is going to mushroom, because we need that.
But you see, I see my work with people who are ready to be leaders or to have an influence in a complex world. But the qualities that I ask them to develop, these qualities can be transmitted by simply having the spirit of dialogue in oneself. There is no better way to learn how to dialogue than being in interaction with somebody who is profoundly good at dialogue, who has developed the dialogue abilities. I think I don't think it would be realistic to ask that a whole population understand the complexity of what we're living right now, but the kindness, the compassion, the capacity to listen, and so on, help people evolve a little bit. More, Carl Rogers said that the quality of listening helped more than any therapeutic technique.
Let me ask this, maybe our final question, because we only have probably about 5 or 6 minutes. But I see a paradox in when I read your book. And that paradox is that Bohm's work, it seems to me, the intent is to end the fragmentation of society. And you've just been talking to some extent about that through this ability to talk together. And yet your work and Mario's, who you reference in the book, and Steve Goldersleeve and Walter, all of these people wind up saying, we don't see it helping management a whole lot in terms of what they do. We see it helping individuals develop themselves. And so that's an interesting paradox. You're seeing it as individual development, and you just spoke about that, the heart and the mind and so forth. And yet it seems to me Bohm's hope was much larger than that. Yeah. So can you speak to that for a moment?
Yes, I have been dealing with that paradox. What I'd like in the best world is that Bohm dialogue is used to educate those who are ready for Bohm dialogue, which means it's a personal development, but that the capacity to listen and so the abilities are transposed when you work with other people. It's to make the dialogue leaders or dialogue facilitators that go where the pure method is not called for, because it would, but these people have it inside them to not foster polarization, or to move from debate to warm questioning, to move from wanting to be right to wanting to understand and all that. And that is enough of a medicine, I think, to help a society to evolve. But no, it's not for everybody. And Bohm was, from what I understand, a great intellectual who was navigating in intellectual circles, and it's very different. And you can perhaps change some scientists' way of thinking in Bohm dialogue, but you cannot change everybody's way of thinking.
Yes, and you and others have tried it in companies, like Mario says, you know, that if companies are focused on solving a problem and so forth, they're impatient about the dialogue. But I like your way of saying it, that it is indeed, it is not about everybody in the company starting to do dialogue. It is about the individuals in the company having the capacity to listen and to question with warmth, and so that it, in the end, it does seem to me it is an individual development process.
Yes.
And one thing
Yeah,
that I really got was, it might not be happening just in one organization, but if you bring enough people together amongst many organizations, they'll go back and then model it within their organization. That's what I'm hearing you say, because it's more difficult to bring a number of people in an organization who already know each other, right?
We broke our nose with a bank and with a manufacturer that where the leader wanted to bring dialogue. It didn't work at all.
Didn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that.
I love that phrase, it broke our noses.
Okay, well, unless you have something you want to say again, Nancy, I think we're about ready to move into our small groups. Do you have any other final?
Well, I would say that Marie-Ève has proposed at least something for people to tentatively talk about. You don't have to stick to this, but let me read it, because I thought it was really helpful. She says, at this time of our history, how do you maintain your faith in human nature and in the power of dialogue to continuously develop yourself and the qualities of heart and mind that make you a facilitator of dialogue wherever you are? So I think that's worth the group saying a bit about.
Good.
All right, well, what I'm going to do with that is suggest that we break into small groups and kind of hold that lightly as we move into that domain.
Linda,
yes.
Linda, before you do that, Nancy, would you repeat that whole one more time so we hear it twice?
Yeah, it's a lovely thing. At this time of our history, how do you maintain your faith in human nature and in the power of dialogue to continuously develop in yourself the qualities of heart and mind that make you a facilitator of dialogue wherever you are?
Thank you. Thanks.
Could you drop it in the chat box?
Okay, so
and we are at 26 now participants. So if you divide us, then.
So I think we're still, so that still gives us 8 groups. Some will have 3, or I could take us down to 7.
All right, that will be fine. Yeah.
Let's do 8 groups. So some of you will find that you won't have a full 4. So what I'm going to do is make 8 rooms, and what happens here is you will be asked to, or actually you'll be assigned to one of the breakout rooms. I'm going to open all the rooms.
And you.
And can you still, hopefully you can still hear me. Go ahead and jump into the room you've been assigned, and I will bring you back with 2 minutes to go.